Okay, greetings, fellow space travelers. Bionic Dance here. And I'm also joined by Tim Hull, I assume that's how your last name's pronounced, from 1 Minute Apologist. Say hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
So, a little bit of back history. About, 2 months ago, I made a video response to a video from 1 Minute Apologist and sent it to them. Which honestly, I never expected to get a reply because, as we know, most theists on YouTube will turn off their comments and turn off their ratings and never have any communication with anyone outside their bubble. So imagine my surprise when Tim emails me back with a reply. And we've been emailing back and forth ever since. But, it wasn't always civil, to say the least. But then you were in San Diego a couple of weeks ago. And so we met up for coffee and had a bit of a live chat. And that made it easier to relate to each other, to communicate, I think, even though we still disagree. So
true, very true.
So it seemed like a good idea to try to take this into a more public venue. And I don't know if you're open to making this a regular thing or not, like maybe once a week, once a month, I don't know. But if this goes well, I'm open to the idea.
Definitely.
So our topic, one of the weird rabbit holes down which we went, was about the nature of things. What makes a thing as opposed to another thing? Is it its nature, its component parts, its use? What? So I think that's where we'll start.
Yeah, this is classically known as the problem of the one and the many. How do you differentiate between the one and the many thing? And there was a famous philosopher, his name is escaping me right now, but he used the example of a cloud. So when we're on the ground, we're looking up at a cloud, we see that it kind of looks like a complete cloud, but the closer we get to the cloud, we realize that the edges of the cloud are hard to define, and where do all of the water molecules end and where does the cloud begin? And so, yeah, this is kind of a classic problem within philosophy. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Well, we were in a coffee shop at the time, so our example was a cup or a mug or something. I completely forgot to bring one with me, so I figure an energy drink can will have to fit the bill for now. And so I was saying that, because we started this from the idea of actually part of the Kalam cosmological argument is anything that begins to exist has a cause. And I was disputing the very idea of beginning to exist in the first place, because we've only seen things change. That matter and energy have taken on new forms rather than beginning to exist. But you made a different argument about that, and I think you were using like conception and birth as a beginning to exist example.
Well, yeah, I mean, when Craig lays out his more philosophical idea of what it means to begin to exist, he says anything that has an essential property, and that when something obtains to a new essential property, that's then it's said to begin to exist. So at any point, whenever that happens, that is the label that is worn, begins to exist. So both conception, you have a new property of the egg coming together with the sperm, and then there's a new property, there's a new life, a new set of DNA that is continuing to be developed, that continues to grow. And so that is a beginning of sense. And the same thing, and you're using your example of the can in the manufacturing facility, when all the parts are come together, boom, you have a new can, it said to begin to exist. So that's kind of what Craig is, again, loosely talking about there. We can go into more detail about that. But there's lots of subtopics that come from this, which I thought why it was such an interesting topic. Is we have to talk about what identity is, what existence is. All of those fun things are surrounded within this topic.
Well, I mean, that's where I started to get into some disagreement with William Lane Craig, and I guess by extension with you, is that I think of something as beginning to exist more in the sense of nothing was there, then something was there, because that differentiates it from change. So when someone says that anything that begins to exist has a cause, if we're going to talk about the manufacturing of a can, well, I completely agree that this began to exist in that sense, but I don't think we can then apply that to the universe, is the thing. Because it's a different kind of beginning to exist. Unless there was material already there and then it changed, we're talking about a completely different kind of beginning to exist.
Yes, but you even just admitted right there in your comments that they both began to exist based on the definition that of begin to exist. So anytime something has
No,
a
I
new
disagree.
property, okay, go ahead.
Because adding a new property, an essential property, as you put it, is different from not being there in the first place. I mean, when this can has a new essential property during the manufacture process, something changed into this can. But unless you're going to say that something was there before the universe began, then it's still something coming from nothing rather than something changing. So I do think that it's a bit of a category error to conflate the manufacture of a can with the beginning of a universe. I mean, unless we're going to both agree that there was an eternal singularity there, then it's not the same.
Well, again, if we agree on the definition of begin to exist, that at time t, there was no essential property, and then at time t1, there was an essential property, then yes, it does fit into that category. Just because there's other extraneous things, like one's in a manufacturing plant and one is hard to categorize as far as what the nature of the beginning or what of the state of affairs that came before it is, that doesn't change the definition of begin to exist. So unless you're saying, well, I don't agree with your definition of begin to exist, which is that at time t, there's no essential property there, and then at time t1, there is the essential property there. That's what seems like to me that you're disagreeing with. Just because there's a difference, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the categories are thrown out the window, right? There are differences. We've admitted that when we talked about in the coffee shop. We admitted that there are differences to those two situations, but unless you change the definition of begin to exist, which I don't think you're doing, then the category the difference doesn't necessarily mean it's a defeater for the position.
Well, the problem that I'm having with it is that, like I say, it's two different kinds of beginning to exist. It's like, again, if one of them is change and the other is something from nothing, you cannot conflate the two. Even if we agree that they are both beginning to exist, to point to the manufacture of a can and say that's the same kind of beginning to exist as the beginning of the universe, well, I have to disagree quite strongly. But if we're going to agree that...
So how would you reword the first premise?
How would
you reword the first premise of the Kalam cosmological
well, I suppose
argument?
It depends on what the goal is of the argument, what the eventual conclusion.
That's not how arguments work. That's not how our arguments work, though. If you have an observation that you see, that's a data point, and you use that as a premise within your argument, and then you have your major premises and minor premises. If your logic is valid and your premises are sound, your conclusion must follow. And so you don't start with the conclusion and say, I have this conclusion. I need to work back and think about what propositions, what data fits this conclusion. That's not how arguments work.
No, of course it isn't. But at the same time, if I were to reword the Kalam cosmological argument as it's already written, so that the first premise and the conclusion are as related as they need to be, so that we're not bringing in false conclusions or conclusions that don't fit what's being said, or if we're conflating two things that are not similar enough to be conflated, then I would need to know what I'm trying to say in the first place. And if in the end what I'm trying to say is that the universe had a cause, then I would have to very seriously consider what I mean by begins to exist. I mean, if I wanted to say anything that changes had a cause for that change, then okay, yes, I agree with the way, with what Kalam is trying to say. But if instead I was saying something from nothing has a cause, then I would not put it in the same category as manufacturing a can, thus producing change, had a cause. I don't think they're similar enough to use Kalam as it's worded. And thus, if I'm going to, for what I would consider honestly, reword Kalam, I would need to know what I'm trying to say to reword it properly.
Well, okay, so I think there's a number of different points there that we could talk about. And again, we'll go back to the idea of begins to exist. So anything that begins to exist, you have a non-essential property, then you have an essential property possessed by something, right? That is said to begin to exist. Now, if you're at all suggesting that there could have been a state of affairs when there was absolutely philosophically nothing, then that would be something that would have to also be talked about, because as far as the nature of the Kalam cosmological argument is concerned, there was no state of affairs when there was absolute nothing, when there was no physics, when there was no properties, when there was no reality at all. So that's, again, for you to say, well, if you're talking about nothing coming into something, that's not what the first column or the first premise of the cosmological argument is talking about, because basically, in a metaphysical sense, the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is saying that something cannot come from nothing. There had to be something for you to get something else. So if there is something, then there would have had to have been a previous state of affairs with something. The Kalam cosmological argument is saying we're talking about what the nature of the something was that was before the space, matter, time, and energy that we call the universe, or all space, time, and matter and energy, even in the sense of a multiverse.
Okay, but the problem with that then is we do end up with the infinite regression. Well, before this there was this. Okay, before that there was that. We get that infinite regress, and a lot of theists obviously like to stop that regress with God and saying this thing here was eternal, this God here was eternal, but that seems to me to be begging the question. So, and it's, well, because there's absolutely no proof or evidence of that. There's only arguments for that. And that's another.
Just the opposite, though.
How?
That's just the opposite, because what you're doing is you're saying, if we know that the universe is a series of contingent things, it cannot be an infinite regress into the past for philosophical and scientific reasons, then there must be something else that is the opposite or the antithesis of everything that the universe is, and that's what we call God. And so you in philosophy and in science, you don't necessarily need to be looking at the thing that you're saying, oh, well, that is the cause. That's what the logical inference is all about. That's what deduction is all about. That's what all those different pieces are talking about. That's a whole thing. It's a whole metaphysical thing. So we're talking about metaphysical principles based on observations that we have within the universe. We're talking about cause and effects, things coming from previous states of affairs. We're saying that as far as we understand, you could even limit this to saying, as far as we know right now, the universe could not be eternal because there cannot be a past series of infinite events. And so therefore, there must be something that is not physical, not space, time, and energy, not all of those things that preceded the universe, because something else that we know is that logical contradiction can't be true, and you can't have something coming from nothing. You can't have no potential create something. That doesn't make any sense. It's, again, that it falls over logically.
That's the thing, though, is it may not make any sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true or not possible, because there are a lot of things that we used to think made no sense at all. And then once we started making more advances, we're better able to detect things, to measure things. We suddenly realized, no, actually, it does make sense. We just didn't know enough. So
No,
to
that's a
say that,
different form of make sense. That's a different form of make sense that I'm talking about. We're talking about logical contradiction. Something cannot be a logical contradiction and be true. Like
well,
if that's something that we can at least agree on and move forward with, then it's really hard to discuss anything, because anything that we discuss, the negation of that could also be true. So that's not what I mean when we're talking about that. I'm not
okay.
using make sense in terms of we cognitively get it. I'm saying it cannot be both true and not true in the same sense and in the same way at the same time.
Well, what are you picturing as being potentially true and potentially not true? What are the things that you think are actual contradictions that
To
can't
have
be?
to get something from nothing. You can't have potential. If something has no potential, you can't get something from that. That would
So,
be a contradiction in reality.
so if this spaceless, timeless, whatever thing that we call God, apparently, like created the universe, where was that potential? What did it create the universe from?
His being. Again, like, and I don't
So,
that's I don't have to be able to give an answer to that. I don't have to know the how to of God created in order to use that as a conclusion. That
well,
wouldn't make any
I,
sense.
I
Just
wasn't
like
asking.
wouldn't need to
Wait,
say if
wait,
we
wait, wait,
find
wait. I wasn't
okay.
asking how. I was asking what. Like what was the substance of the universe that had the potential to be the universe as we know it, that God, whatever it may have been, created? Was it already there? Was that matter and energy already there before God decided to jumpstart the Big Bang, or did it have to be created from nothing?
No, it was created from God's being, who's the ground of all reality.
Okay,
Like
that
we
honestly,
just established that there was no physics, that there was no space time and energy, that the universe
uh,
itself
no, that's
was
something you
not
said.
existence.
I didn't necessarily agree to it.
I'm not saying
I
that you.
mean,
I'm not saying you agree to it. I'm just saying when I like it was odd that what I described, and then you said, "Yeah, but what was the substance?" And I said, "There wasn't a substance. There was just God."
well, but that's the
Like,
thing is you were saying that the potential has to be there. And so if the matter and energy weren't already there, then the potential for it to be there had to be something. And to just say, oh, it was God's being, well, we have no reason to think that. None at all.
why? Why?
Well, what reason do we have to think it?
I just gave you a reason, because we can't have an infinite
Oh,
regress of past physical events.
okay, that is an argument. I'm asking for evidence.
In this conversation, those are exactly the same.
They're not. They're really not. Because unless there is something we can study and measure when it comes to matter and energy, then anything we come up with is at best a hypothesis.
No, that's not how metaphysics works.
Well, okay, but that's an argument that you and I have had about metaphysics and how necessary they are and how they're formed. So that's. Do you want to go down that rabbit hole?
I think it's important, because what the Kalam cosmological argument is saying is that there's a metaphysical principle of something cannot come from nothing. And if you want to deny that, then again, you're standing far outside of both science and philosophy. And so that, to me, you would need more of a you would need to present more of a justification to say that you can have an absolute philosophical nothing, no God, no time, no space, no matter, no energy, no nothing at all, no pure act, no existence, no essence, nothing, and then have something. Seems far more unreasonable of a leap than saying that God, whose essence is his existence, can create the universe.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter that it doesn't seem that it seems more reasonable or less reasonable. What matters are the facts. And right now,
Right,
I
but
don't
you
think
don't
we
have
have any.
facts without that. No, you don't.
Exactly. That's the thing. We don't have the facts. We
You
don't have the evidence. We don't have any reason to think what you're saying is true other than that it feels good.
no, that's not what I meant. Let me rephrase. What I meant was,
Okay.
in your worldview, you could not state X is a fact without the metaphysical principles. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, but again, I have told you many times in our emails that my metaphysical principles are malleable based on evidence, experimentation, because I freely admit that I could be completely freaking wrong. And so
Yep,
I
me
have
too.
to adjust
I completely
to,
agree. Yep, I
okay,
completely agree.
okay.
Yep,
I have to admit,
I've
it
never
didn't.
denied that.
Okay, it sounded like you were saying definitely not that in your emails, but I accept your clarification.
Nope.
Okay, then under what metaphysical principles are you operating currently?
The theistic worldview. I mean,
Okay,
again, so this is a clarification that I think was really important. Based on your email, what you just said, you said it seems like that theists start with this conclusion and try to fit everything in it.
yes.
And I was very clear in a previous email that I talked about that my worldview is the conclusion based on the evidence. So we look at something like data, right? We go back to the very beginning of this conversation and say, we have this problem of the one and the many. How do we solve this problem, right? What's the best explanation that we can use, a metaphysical principle, to solve this problem and work forward? And so we have a data point that we both agree on, and then we look at the different metaphysical options that are out there, the explanatory power of each, and then we look at which one works the best, and then we continue to move forward. Just like every argument that I've put forward, it starts with that general observation. We look at and we say, okay, I'm looking, I'm observing, and I'm seeing cans going from non-existence to existence. Then we extrapolate that out and say, this is a metaphysical principle, that something can't come from nothing.
Okay, but again, the problem is that the can is made of matter and energy that we know already exists. So, I mean, I've asked you before, when does this can become a can and what makes it a can as opposed to the component atoms that make it up? But that's the thing, though, is where were those component atoms? Where was the matter and energy prior to the expansion that we call the Big Bang?
Well, but the premise too of the Kalam cosmological argument says that it began to exist, right? So asking the question, where was it, seems nonsensical in the confines of what we're talking about.
But that's the problem, is within the confines of what we're talking about. But I think those confines are actually too restrictive, you see.
How so?
Because again, begins to exist. I mean, like I keep pointing out, matter and energy are the substance that make up something like a can. Yes?
No, again, that's not what we're talking. That is part of the issue. Again,
Right.
that's right.
But
So let's go back to the topic. What makes a thing a thing?
yes.
So if you're saying it's merely if it's merely matter and energy which makes a thing, then no thing is actually a thing.
I didn't say that. What I said was matter and energy make up a thing. That a thing is I say constructed, formed of matter and energy. But I'm asking where the matter and energy that make up the entire universe as we know it, like how did that begin to exist? The matter and energy itself, rather than having it take the form that we know of it today.
Okay, so first I'd like to clarify why a how explanation matters to the conversation that we're having.
Okay. Okay. Uh-oh. Are you frozen? I hope he's not frozen. No, okay, you're shaking your head. So I said, go on.
No,
you say the how
as I said,
matters.
I need you to explain
You want
why
me
the
to
how matters to an explanation. That's what I don't understand. If I can't, let's say I can't explain how something came about, does that mean that it did not come about?
No, but if the argument is that whatever begins to exist has a cause, well, if matter and energy are the only things we've ever known, the only things we've ever observed changing in any way, in that begins to exist way you've been describing, then we don't know anything. We know absolute squat about where that matter and energy originated. And so if we don't know how that came to be, there's no way we can necessarily say it had a cause, because the only things which have a cause that we know of, that we've ever observed, that we can ever measure, is change of matter and energy rather than creation of matter and energy. They're too radically different to conflate the two.
Okay, so again, we covered this, but we can cover it in more detail if we need to. So what you're saying is, it seems like to me that your metaphysical kind of ground floor, your foundation, is this idea of observation. We have to have observation in order to be able to know anything at all. Would you agree with that statement?
Or at least even to extrapolate from data. But like I say, we have nothing to extrapolate from in terms of the creation of matter and energy. Change, yes, but beginning of substance existence, no. And so anything we say about it is pure speculation at best. At best.
Right. So what we're looking for here is some metaphysical foundations from metaphysical groundwork, right? That's what I'm not sure where we're missing each other on this point. And I think that this is a really solid place to kind of just rest for a bit and make sure that we come to some conclusions. So I'm not saying, just reiterate, I'm not saying that we can't change metaphysical understandings of things. There have been changes in metaphysical understandings of things over the last 2,500 years as philosophy has progressed. That's fine. Again, I'm not saying that. But there needs to be some sort of metaphysical groundings for where we're going and what we're doing. And that entails the work of science, does it not?
Sure. But I mean, I guess part of the problem here is that I don't think we should be coming to conclusions or even necessarily speculating before we can really justify the hypothesis that we've come up with. I think that positing whatever it is you want to call the beginning, if you call it God, whatever it was, we know nothing about it. Nothing. We don't even know it's really there. I mean, the best we can do is to infer it. And I mean, if you think that you can do more than infer that this thing exists, if you think that there's any way we can lab test it, I'd like to know.
Well, again, you're jumping the gun there, because we can't lab test anything unless we understand or agree to metaphysical principles.
I disagree. Honestly, I really disagree. How so? Because if we're delving into something that we really haven't seen yet at all, how are you even going to form those metaphysical principles to deal with it? I mean, we have some pretty decent metaphysical principles for dealing with the, forgive me, physical, but we don't have anything, and any basis, any grounding whatsoever to deal with that which isn't physical, that which is pre-physical. So how are we supposed to say anything about it?
So say that one more time. We don't have any metaphysical to determine what is pre-physical. I kind of missed the end of that.
To even describe it, to know anything about it. I mean, pre-singularity, if a singularity is how the universe as we know it, what it expanded from, we know nothing. And so to start positing things like gods is jumping the gun itself.
So when you say we know nothing, are you saying that we have absolutely no justification for that belief? Or are you saying that we have no certainty towards it? So when you use no there, what?
I'm saying we have no data.
So you're saying that the philosophical arguments for the impossibility of an infinite past regress is not data.
Right. It's not, well, okay, this, for those watching who haven't been privy to our email conversations back and forth, we've been having some disagreements about what I'm calling ivory tower philosophy versus boots on the ground, get your hands dirty lab work. And I've been pretty inflexible on this one. You need the hard data, you need the lab testing, the quintuple blind studies before you can start saying, aha, this is what's so. If all you have is the thinking about it portion, well, I can think up any darn thing, doesn't make it true. So I want to know why something like, say, for example, the first premise of the Kalam has any relevance whatsoever pre-singularity.
Well, because again, it goes back to the metaphysical principle that you can't get something from that. Like if you have absolute philosophical nothing, that has no potential, that has no properties, that has no ability or anything at all, no essence to it, it would be a contradiction in terms, a contradiction in reality to get something. So the fact that we have something means that there was never a state of absolute nothingness. Can we agree on that?
I can agree that we're pretty... Well, that's the thing. I don't know, actually. I really, genuinely, honestly don't know. It makes sense that there was never a time when there was nothing. It makes a certain kind of satisfying, visceral sense. But again, we don't have the data for it. I mean, for all we know,
So just to be
logic
clear,
itself could break down under certain conditions. We don't know. I mean, it seems to me like if there is a deity of some sort, that deity has reality-breaking powers. So if that's going to be a hill on which you want to plant your flag, the existence of a deity, well, that's another rabbit hole we could go down entirely, the limits of this God's power.
Whoa, wait a second. Reality-breaking powers? What does that even mean?
Well, making the impossible happen. Like under certain conditions, we know when lightning is supposed to occur under certain conditions. And if someone has any kind of supernatural abilities, be they a god or a mage, and yes, I play way too much D&D, but a god or a mage exercising these powers will make lightning appear where lightning has no business appearing according to physics. So that is what I mean.
But that's not what impossible means.
Okay, what does impossible mean then?
It means that it would be a logical contradiction for something to happen. That lightning appearing where we didn't predict lightning before is not a logical contradiction. That would be improbable, but that would not be impossible. The only thing that's impossible
Really?
are logical contradictions. Yes.
Okay, so a phenomenon that happens in nature and requires certain conditions in order to happen, if that were to happen without those conditions, and if we were to study the conditions under which it happened and found no reason why that thing should happen and yet it did, that's not the impossible happening? That's not breaking reality? That's not turning physics on its head completely?
No, that's what we would call improbable.
I think it's what we would call magic.
There's three layers of... Well, you were talking about possibilities, so throwing things in there like magic, it doesn't really get us anywhere. So there's logical possibilities, and logical possibilities are things that would, A being non-A or X being non-X at the same time in the same sense. So if you can show the logical impossibility in something, then that would be the only thing that's impossible. You can have things that are metaphysically possible, and metaphysically impossible typically is, again, there's lots of definitions of this, but is that it cannot be imagined at all. Like you cannot even conceive of that happening. So it doesn't create a logical contradiction necessarily, but it's inconceivable. That may be what you're talking about. And then there's also the physically improbable or impossible, like the word that you used, but that would be something that just says, we just don't have an explanation for it currently. We don't have a physical explanation for how I can jump 60 feet in the air. That's highly improbable, but that doesn't mean that it's actually logically impossible, because there's no logical contradiction in me jumping 60 feet in the air. It's super, 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 super unlikely that's going to happen. I would consider it improbable, but not impossible.
Okay, well, let's put it this way. If that jumping 60 feet in the air were to happen in such a way that nothing physical should have been able to propel you that high, and yet it happened anyway, you're going to say that that's just improbable, that locomotion without having that opposite force is only improbable.
Well, yeah, because this is Michael Shermer's objection. Are you familiar with Michael Shermer?
I know the name, but you know my memory issues, so you'll have to refresh me on exactly what he said.
Right. Well, I mean, again, so Michael Shermer, Matt Dillahunty, they all use this. Matt Dillahunty, in a debate with Jackson Hunter and with Michael Licona, admitted that seeing somebody get their head chopped off, like looking at the person, head lopped off on the ground. It's kind of a graphic. I apologize for the children watching. Graphic. Then sees the person walk into the room 5 minutes later, would not admit that they rose from the dead. He would say, it could have been some sort of alien. It could be technology that we don't know about. That's Michael Shermer's line. Oh, it's just a miracle claim. Anything that seems improbable that actually happens. Resurrections could just be some technology or law that we don't know about yet, that we just haven't quite discovered. So it's still physical. I still put in the naturalistic explanations. That's just what it is. Just didn't know about it yet. That's like, to me, I'm going by what they're saying and saying you're not holding that line, and so I'm just wondering why.
Well, that's the thing, though, is, I mean, I actually kind of do hold that line because when I point to, say, for example, the beginning of the universe, I would think that it's just something we don't understand yet. But that's where I differ from people who say God did it, that there is a God that is able to do it. I'm like, that to me is not the best explanation. That to me is not the most logical explanation. It's just some blind physical force like everything else. We just don't know what it is yet because we haven't gotten that boots on the ground, get your hands dirty data in order to be able to study it. And I know that scientists are working on it. So I think that it's very premature to start speculating about deities, eternal like energy or spirits or whatever you want to call them, because we don't have enough to be able to say what the best explanation even is yet. That's why I think you're jumping the gun.
And I can think that. Right. Well, I think that we differ, but like I said at the cafe, is that I think when we start to kind of parse out a lot of these different issues, and we say what is the best explanation for some of these, we start to see kind of the naturalistic worldview just starts to topple over a little bit, that it can't support what it's saying. And this is kind of what we're talking about in the email, is you kept referring to things like, when I said, I think you're begging the question, and you kept saying in the Inigo Montoya voice, you keep saying this, and I don't think it means what you think it means.
Yeah, I did say that.
If you're using the scientific method in order to be able to justify the scientific method, would you not agree that that is the definition of begging the question?
I wouldn't say that's what I'm doing.
Okay, but again, so I'm pointing out that I said in the email specifically, and again, I'm trying to summarize it for the viewers, that if you're using your methodology to justify your methodology, that is circular. And so there needs to be something else other than your methodology, some grounding for that you're using to say, from here, it's step one, I can then take a step to step two, instead of just starting on step two and saying, here we go, right? And that's where in that step one, that's what I'm putting in the category of metaphysical principles. Things like cause and effect, things like that things actually exist, that there is an objective truth. We can actually look for those objective truths, that something can't be and not be at the same time in the same sense, that something is what it is and not what it isn't, something that there's nothing in the middle, law of excluded middle. All those things are metaphysical truths. Yes, we can derive some of them from observations, and yes, we could say that they're somewhat malleable or somewhat maybe not held in the highest level of certainty in a Descartes sense, in Rene Descartes type sense, but I think that they're building blocks that we must have in place for our metaphysical foundation in order to be able to do science, to be able to do falsification, to be able to do justification. All of those pieces are important to have in place before we move forward.
Okay, well, that's kind of where we got into a disagreement, where I'm not sure I was able to adequately convey my point, is that my metaphysics, as you put it, are malleable, that they are not something, that they are not a starting point from which I then start examining the universe, but rather they are built from examining the universe. I try something. Did it work or did it not work? If it did work or if it didn't work, then I use that as another plank in that platform on which I stand, because you have
Completely.
to be
That's
able
exactly
to.
what I'm saying.
It sounds like the opposite of what you're saying, honestly.
No, I'm saying we observe cause and effect, and
Mhm.
then we can infer the universality of cause and effect. We say, what are the implications if cause and effect is not universal? And then we say, if the implications that cause and effect are not universal, not absolute, they have these, X, we'll just put it over here, they have these implications. Well, those implications mean that we can't trust science, that we can't do science. Therefore, it is reasonable to accept that the universality of
Well,
cause and effect.
wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. See, I disagree on that point right there. If we couldn't rely on cause and effect, we could still do science. We just do it differently.
How so? How can you say that one state of affairs giving rise to another state of affairs, which is cause and effect? If that's not reliable, we could do science at all.
Well, because oh gosh, how do I put this? If one state of affairs doesn't necessarily follow from another state of affairs, I mean, okay, maybe we couldn't do science exactly, but we'd have to be able to
It's gotta be
incorporate,
random.
but we'd have to incorporate that into how we interact with the universe regardless. And in that way, we could start trying to at least understand the universe. I mean, maybe there are just certain causes, certain effects that don't necessarily follow from cause, but most everything else does. That's the sort of place where I'd start to say we're getting into the realm of the supernatural, for example. So if that were true, then science would still be science as we know it, plus this added arcane supernatural part that we don't necessarily understand, might not be able to understand. And it's not even necessarily that I'm saying that cause might not follow from effect, but rather that if cause and effect seemed wildly unrelated, but they still happen. I mean, like, again, if I were to throw something up in the air, and let's hope this doesn't burst from carbonation, I mean, we know about gravity. We know how gravity works. We know why it's going up and down like that. But if it started going up and down like that, we couldn't identify the force that was making it happen. Or perhaps it was always happening when I hit middle C on a piano for no good reason. It just seems that those two are related somehow, that's the cause, that's the effect. But we don't see any way whatsoever that the vibrations from that particular string in the piano being struck would make something go up and down like someone was tossing it. Well, again, cause and effect seem to be there, but they're not related the way me moving my hand up to throw the can are. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, but even you hitting middle C and having some sort of distant reaction to you hitting middle C on a keyboard would still be a cause and effect relationship. There would still be
Sure.
a state of affairs that gives rise to another state of affairs.
But does it make
And
any
again, what
sense
you're
at all?
describing is
there any logic to it happening?
it doesn't matter necessarily because there
Well,
is
of course it
logic to it.
matters. Is there?
Well, no, I'm saying, but there is. Well, again, if you want to take the Descartesian or the Humean, skeptic route to say that we cause and effect are completely illusory. That was Hume's big thing, is that cause and effect are completely illusory. They're only psychological thing. There's no actual causation. There's only correlation. When I see a billiard ball, when I see the cue ball hit the 8 ball and hit it in the corner pocket, that's just a mental connection that I'm making. There's actually no real world connection between those. That was Hume's point. That was one of, again, that Hume brought to this philosophical discussion, is he's basically saying there is none of that. There's only correlation. There's no causation at all. And so if that's the road that you want to go down,
no,
then I'm
it's
not sure how you're doing science.
No, it's not. It's not
Great.
the road I
So
want to go
you're
down.
not taking Hume's perspective.
It was a hypothetical, is what it is. It was a thought exercise. Is if
Right, I'm with you.
If we find things, okay. So I guess what I'm saying then is that my metaphysics are built on the platform from which I reason is built on these experiences and checking to see, like, does this work? Does that work? Does it not work? If not, why not? But when we get to things like, say, the beginning of the universe as we know it, matter and energy, we don't know why there is something rather than nothing. I mean, we have no data.
Again,
for
I would
it.
say we're not certain. Well, okay, we have data in the sense that we know other truths, like something cannot come from nothing.
Not what I mean by
That's a
data, but go on.
And if again, well, so again, if we can't agree that something cannot come from nothing, then you would admit and say all somethings may be coming from nothings all the time, and we don't see that.
Well, I mean, well, okay. Number one, based like purely on my layman's understanding of quantum mechanics, it sure seems like we are seeing that on a very, very, very subatomic level. But even if we're not, the point is that we have a universe. We know that. And why it's here, we don't know. And and what we've seen so far is something coming from something. That's all we've ever seen. But we don't
exactly something coming from something. That's what I said. We completely agree.
Okay, but what we don't know is why there is something. Like, was this something always eternal? Was it always there? And if the answer is no, then
what we don't know is the nature of the eternal something. That's what your question is right now.
So then I guess my question would have to be,
I stated that before.
Why God? Why a deity?
Well, I mean, again, we can continue to go down the road, but we have to first establish that the something that created the matter and energy that we see now, that we exist in now, is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, eternal, personal, all those, because they're the negation and the necessary conditions in order to be able to have something.
Okay,
right? And you're like, whoa, you just made this big, huge, giant leap here, right? But that's why they're involved in the definition of premise 2 of the Kalam cosmological argument.
Okay,
so that's what we're talking about when we say like the universe.
Okay, but I'm not going to agree to the whole spaceless, timeless, yada, 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 until I start having something lab testable for it. Until then, I'm treating it purely as speculation.
Okay, but what you're we're starting to kind of go in multiple circles here. So you can't have lab tested immaterial stuff, and so that to me doesn't make any sense. What you're saying is I want to be able to lab test. Like I asked you this at the cafe, and we can do it again because I think it's worthwhile here. How are you lab testing the law of non-contradiction? So how do you lab test that? Go ahead and lay it out for me.
Well, I'm not, but the thing is, I'm also not claiming that it has a physical presence either. I'm not claiming that it has, I'm not saying that it is a force in the physics sense of a force. The law of non-contradiction is not a law so much as a description of what we see.
So you're saying it's possible for something to be X and not X at the same time in the same way.
What I'm saying is I don't know.
Okay, but how would you know? That's what I'm saying. Like, how would you know if I'm going to lab test anything and I'm going to get to, and I conclude X? How do you know that X isn't non-X? Because you can't use observation, because and if you're going to use observation, it has to also be available to be non, right? Because that's what you're talking about. If you're going to use the law of non-contradiction to say, well, this is logically impossible, you have demonstrated that, so it can't be that. So this goes back to the whole topic of the discussion, is how do you know that? What are you using in your lab test to be able to say, I conclude X, that you are at least probable, at least highly reasonable to conclude that it's not non-X?
Well, see, here's the thing, though, is for me, that doesn't matter yet. It will matter eventually, but it will matter yet, because first what you have to do is get whatever it is you're going to put in a test tube. You have to get the thing that the radiation meter is going to check. You have to know there's even something to study in the first place.
Right, which you haven't been able to establish because the law of non-contradiction, you just claimed that
you're the
a reality.
one who hasn't been able to do it because you're not giving me something to put under a microscope.
No, and again, as soon as you, how do I put my pen under a microscope to investigate what the pen is, unless I can say that this is a pen and not a pen.
Well, it's called observation. You see what it's doing, you see what it's not doing.
No, you can't. You can't rely on observation for the law of non-contradiction, because you haven't established that it's going to actually that what you're observing is not what you're not observing.
Okay, actually, okay, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, because I'm not a physicist, but I know there's this experiment where if you try to find something, I don't remember what it is, like radiation or something, light, where you try to detect it. And if you detect it as a wave, it's a wave. But if you detect it as a particle, it's a particle. But you can't detect it as both at the same time, ever. Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, but that doesn't... Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that's
Okay.
Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Someone just put that in the chat as well. That does not negate the law of non-contradiction. Because if you have an observer and the wave collapses, because again, it's a different sense, right? That's why the sense is important. Like what condition it is important. I mean, I have a number of threads that I could go back to discuss this if you want to give me a second to pull it up. But I've had atheistic philosophers and science. This guy has I believe he has a PhD in chemistry, and he has a PhD in philosophy. His name is Sam Priest. If anyone looks him up, maybe I just gave him away. But he has debated a number of atheists on this exact point, and atheists will say very similar things, that like that quantum mechanics negates the classical laws of logic, and that's just not so. Even things like Bell's inequality theorem does not
why isn't it so?
The law of non-contradiction, because that is the state of affairs in that moment. It's like spooky action at a distance defies the speed of light, but there could be some underlying principle that connects those two particles, and that's why it doesn't. That's why it's not negating the law of non-contradiction. I mean, again, like I did a good number of research. I am nowhere near. I do not have a PhD. Everybody, this is just stuff that I've read. I took a few philosophy classes and had to turn in some paper, and I've read a number of books. I have one here that I'm working through called The Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It's kind of a hefty book or whatever. So I'm not claiming to be an expert on this. There are people that are way smarter than me, and that's why I'm appealing to people that do have the PhDs, that have done the work and have debated the topics before and have reached the same conclusion that I have. And even when I'm reading the discussions, I'm like, man, I really want to see where this is going, because there is no worldview implication when two atheists are discussing whether or not quantum mechanics negates the law of non-contradiction. It doesn't matter for either of them as far as their worldview goes, right? So that's why I think it's an interesting discussion that they're having. And again, time and time again, this guy Sam was bringing up these same points.
Okay, well, I still want to know, like, I guess what I've been trying to say is that I'm not prepared to commit myself to a conclusion or even necessarily an assertion of any sort without being able to justify it in a way that other people can observe themselves. Like if I were to say that the origin of the universe was not God, but was fill-in physics idea, and I can't give people sufficient reason to think that I'm not full of crap. Like if I can't give people step-by-step instructions to reach the same conclusion I reached and to have them check my work for themselves, then I don't feel comfortable committing myself to saying anything of the sort without a whole bunch of qualifiers of, I'm not sure about this. It seems like it could be. I haven't tested it yet. All of that stuff to let people know, like that they can't throw a gotcha at me as if I was planting my flag on that hill. And that feels like what you're asking me to do, is to plant my flag on a hill where I'm not comfortable doing it yet because I don't feel I have sufficient information, hard data.
On what conclusion exactly? The God question or the law of non-contradiction question?
Well, pretty much all of it, frankly. When we're talking about the origins of the universe, I don't know what they are. I don't know where the matter and energy that make up the universe came from, and I'm not prepared to make any assertions about where it came from because I don't know. And if I don't know, I don't want to say anything about it. I mean, this is one of the things that I find quite frustrating dealing with a lot of theists, not necessarily you, but a lot of theists, is that they prefer a false answer to saying, I don't know. To saying I'm not sure yet, and I would like to find out. But any conclusions I might reach now are tentative. I don't see that from a lot of theists.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. And so I think sometimes that, we got about 5 minutes left before I gotta jump off. But I do want to do this again. I mean, and maybe we'll let your viewers decide if they want me to come back on and continue these conversations. I want to be respectful. I know I can get excited. I apologize, but I've enjoyed this conversation. But one of the things that, and people that know me Facebook feed and in real life and stuff like that will say this, I want people to think too. That's one of the reasons that I'm into Christian apologetics. It's one of the reasons that I work for the organizations that I do and have the conversations that I have often. It's because I want to continue to grow the intellectual passion and the development of the mind in the Christian world as well. And so I have seen some of those same things that you have seen as well, where people kind of just say, oh yeah, that, somebody said it and so I believe it and whatever. And that frustrates me as well. I said, no, I want to continue to grow in this. I mean, even in the men's discipleship group that I'm in on Saturday morning that my brother leads, and I'm just a participant in it, I'm constantly pushing him as a leader to say, we need to be going deeper. We need to be asking some of these questions, because it's very surface level and that's it. And we're starting to do that. And so I'm with you on that. I like the deep dive into the philosophical questions. I like reading those books. I like watching the scientific stuff. The PBS has a science channel where they're talking about it. I watch those things all the time. I enjoy those types of things. So yeah, I'm with you. Like, I'm trying to get my kids to do that as well. I'm asking my kids those questions. My son is almost 9. He's into science. He loves animals, and we're asking those questions too. So I want to say that I'm with you, and we can end maybe on a point of agreement here and agree to say, let's have another conversation like this and keep building. So I'd leave it up to your audience. If they thought this was entertaining, let's do it again. If not, then that can just be up to you. I'll do it no matter what.
Well, I mean, I would like to continue these, certainly, but I also feel like you just didn't address my point, but that's okay. We are running out of time, and apparently you have to pick up your kids. As an atheist, I prefer to eat kids, but you know, that's just a thing.
We'll work on that. Don't worry.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So perhaps for next time, if there is a next time, I don't know how often you want to do this, but we can pick it up. I'd like to pick it up with the whole I don't know answer versus a false answer question.
Well, again, let me just say, falsification implies that there is the law of non-contradiction. So you can't have a false answer without saying that something is true. Right. But that's something that I feel like we have to agree to in order to say anything is false or true.
Well, but that's not really my point, though. What I was really trying to get at was that a lot of people seem to want an imaginary answer that makes them feel satisfied versus an answer of, I don't know yet because I haven't been able to do the proper investigation. I mean, even without the whole question of how do you ground your investigation, it just the need for an answer that and a satisfying answer seems to override a lot of people's willingness to accept their own ignorance and see it as something to be corrected.
Okay, well, so I think what you're talking about is the nature of justification, right? So what qualifies as justifying? So Kate could say, I need X to be able to be justified, or what's sufficient, and Tim could say, I need Y. And if there's no objective standard for what is a valid justification, then that's going to be very difficult, because we're all going to come to the table saying, these are what I need to be justified. So your criticism, though I understand it, is saying everyone has to have the same justification as I do. And if they don't have the same justification that I do, then they have insufficient justification. And I don't think that that's a fair assessment to make. Even within the realm of science, there's there's a number of large schools of thought, but somebody, Karl Popper, and his idea of falsification. Again, I'll read it right here. The main advocate of falsification has been Karl Popper, whom positive test results only show a theory to be possibly true. Those results do not make the truth of a theory more probable. So that's one realm of scientific thought. There's another one right here on the same page, justification. There are different forms of justificationism, but the advocates agree that positive testing results increase the degree of probability that a theory is true. So you could be a justificationist or you could be a falsificationist. Those are two different realms of thought within science. And again,
well,
so depending on which
in the chat has been saying that I think is very important, I think it encapsulates it, is the idea that if you can't show it, you can't know it. And I agree. If
you
someone
can't show that,
says,
that's self-defeating.
If someone says, oh, this again, if I'm talking about if you can't show like the existence of something, if you can't show that something happened, you can't know it. It's not a matter of if you can't show the principle, you can't know the principle. I'm saying if you can't show that the event that happened was possible, you can't know that the event that happened was possible. That's why a lot of atheists ask the whole question, why doesn't God heal amputees? It is because a lot of us suspect that divine healing is just people blowing smoke up each other's asses because we don't ever see the big flashy cures that would make us go, whoa, that could be magical, right? So
or they do, and then we just Michael Shermer and say, those things happen. It could just be an anomaly. We just don't know all the different variables that happen. So my friend, I have a video on my YouTube channel. If you go into Plugged Into Leadership, if you search hashtag Tea with Tim, there's a miracle story on there that you can check out. He's got a doctor interview on there. He's got scans on there. But I have a feeling you're going to say, yeah, but that could have happened. I mean, we do see remissions. Remissions are possible.
Yeah,
so
that's why I'm asking
because
for
they
limbs
are
to be regrown.
possible.
That's why I'm asking for limbs to be regrown, because we're pretty sure that one's not going to happen without some sort of intelligent intervention. I mean, if someone's got a stump and we see it on tape or on film or in person without the help of ILM or Pixar, that's going to turn a lot of our worldviews on their heads. But we never see that sort of thing, and that's a problem.
So Andrew just said I'm lying. I wonder what Andrew thinks I'm lying about. But anyway, so
well,
all right, I gotta roll off the chat right now. But Kate, if you could do me a favor, if you could shoot me an email with the link to this, I'll go ahead and share it on some of the different forums that I'm on, and we'll do this again shortly, probably after Christmas, sometime for the new year.
Okay, well,
fantastic.
Have fun. Don't get run over.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
All right. Until next time, fellow space travelers.
All right. Bye.